Hello and welcome to the Leaders Council podcast, the podcast for the people who run the country and the people who keep the country running. You join us on yet another overcast day here in the capital. I'm Matthew O'Neill, and today, as always, we ensure that we have a variety of distinct perspectives on leadership. First, we're joined by Matthew Scott, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Kent. Mr. Scott was elected as the Conservative candidate for Kent's Police and Crime Commissioner in May 2016, having previously worked in the office of Sir David Evanet MP. In addition to his role as PCC, Scott also serves as the portfolio holder for mental health for the National Association of PCCs and is one of their 3 Brexit spokesmen, as well as serving as chairman of Blue Light Commercial, a company that supports police forces' commercial activity in an effort to save taxpayers' money. Matthew, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, that certainly is quite a lot of weight on your shoulders. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us on the show today.
My pleasure.
Now, I understand that you and I have something in common, and that is that we are both from policing families. My father was a police chief, and your father and your brother were serving officers. Did this experience draw you to the PCC role?
It absolutely did, and that experience of my family is quite important to me. It means that I do take a keen interest in the welfare of both police officers and staff, because in my family I have police staff members as well. And watching as my father policed in London in the 80s and 90s, and now my brother policing in the capital today, you see some of the best of policing, but also some of the really difficult challenges that they bring home with them as well. So it's definitely inspired some of my work, particularly around making sure that officers and staff get a fair deal.
Absolutely, and it's so incredibly important in this period in time as well that they get a fair deal. Can you tell our listeners who may not be so familiar with the role what the responsibilities of a police and crime commissioner are and why the role of PCC is important?
The role of Police and Crime Commissioner was created 8 years ago now. And for me, the role of Police and Crime Commissioner is to be a voice. It's to be a voice for victims, for vulnerable people, and for the voiceless, those people who may be feeling disenfranchised from the criminal justice system or policing, to speak up for them. What does that mean in practice? That means we set the priorities for our local police force and we hold our chief constables to account, with the ultimate ability to hire and fire police chiefs. In addition, I'm responsible for services for victims of crime, making sure that in the event that something does go wrong, that they've got wraparound care for them to help them move on with their life at the time that is appropriate for them. And then finally, I think it's around crime prevention too. Obviously, prevention is better than cure, as everyone will say, but working with charities, with local councils and other organisations to try and stop it from happening in the first place. And we've had many successes in those areas so far. I think for me that sums up the role of Police and Crime Commissioner. And it's important for transparency and accountability. We never really had that before with the old system of police authorities. They were bureaucratic, they were expensive, and there was no real, I believe, constructive oversight of how the police service worked. I think that as PCCs, we're doing a much better job of that now.
Now, in the past, there have been questions raised about the positions of police and crime commissioners, with criticisms about the expenses of PCCs in other counties and with the cost of elections compared to low voter turnout rate for these elections, which in some cases amounts to below 15%. Do you feel that these are fair critiques of the institution, or would you rate the position of PCC in regard to value for money for the taxpayer?
Well, I think that actually PCC personally is one of the best jobs in elected politics, because you have the opportunity to really do things. You are elected with a mandate to go in and make changes. And we've done that in my team, listening to victims of antisocial behaviour, victims of hate crime, but also listening to the voice of policing too, to give them a better say over things. And, here in Kent, we had our experience of my predecessor who didn't really understand the role. She didn't really cover herself in any glory. And in fact, that really impacted on the reputation and the morale of Kent Police over her term. And I've been really keen to try and show what the role can do. We've done that. More police officers, crime is falling, more help for victims, and things like that. And elsewhere across the country, there's some great PCCs doing some work too. Katie Bourne over in Sussex, for example, has done some great work in getting stalking and harassment up to gender. And up in Lincolnshire, where Mark Jones has done some tremendous work around mental health and the system there, acting as a convener of services, showing real leadership in pulling people together to instigate change. I believe it's a much valued role, but I think it is incumbent upon us too to continue to sell it to the public, because as you quite rightly say, the turnout has been quite low. That's disappointment, but I think we do have outside of general elections, a problem with election turnouts, full stop. I think we need to be honest with ourselves about those challenges, but actually go out and sell the benefits of the role.
Now, of course, you just made a passing reference to Anne Barnes, the former PCC for Kent, who was infamous for her appointment of youth and crime commissioners. What changes have you made to the institution since taking office to kind of claw back the reputation?
For me, it's been about refocusing the attentions of the office, making it more about the people that we serve, being that voice and going out there and listening, very proactive on that front. We do it in a very constructive way. It's not about gimmicks. It's not about F and Force One or anything like that. No gimmicks at all. I listen to people. I try and act upon their concerns. I try and make those changes. You know, when people are telling me that they've got problems with drug dealing at the end of their road, or they've got problems with antisocial behaviour in their street, those are just as important as when I'm dealing with victims of domestic abuse and dealing with victims of sexual offences. Mm-hmm. This role is about the people that you serve, not about the person who holds the office. And I hope that is reflected in some of the achievements that we've made in getting more police into the force and hopefully making that difference.
It was recently reported that Kent Police Force must reduce your budget by £9 million in the next financial year. What sort of steps are you taking to achieve this goal?
Well, that is it's slightly different to that in effect. So I've always been keen, as someone who is responsible for taxpayers' money. I've always believed in the phrase, there's no such thing as government money, only taxpayers' money. Is that we should continue to find efficiency and effectiveness wherever we look. And the reason for that is that we can invest that money in bolstering the front line. Many of those savings within that £9 million figure aren't actually cuts. They are generating revenue, doing things better. And that means we've been able to recruit more police officers. And where we've been able to increase our council tax to fund more policing, I didn't want that to go into maintaining things being exactly the same as they were. The continued drive for efficiency and effectiveness has to carry on every single year. So what it has meant is that last year we were able to recruit an extra 180 police officers. This year we're doing another 180 police officers on top of that, as well as more police staff. So I think residents are getting a really good deal out of the budget I set for this year.
And of course, the ONS has recently released a report within the past few weeks showing that crime in Kent has fallen by over 5% in the past year, with over 9,000 fewer crimes in Kent than in previous calendar years. How have you managed to achieve this?
Well, I think there's a few things. One, it's police numbers. I've been saying this the entire time I've been in office. Police numbers do matter, even when we had Home Secretaries who didn't want to hear it. I have to say that Sajid Javid, when he was Home Secretary, really got this, and Priti Patel gets this now. Police numbers do matter, and that's why I was keen and have successfully achieved a complete turnaround in our police situation. So we've got more police in Kent by the end of this year than we've ever had, and we'll have even more on top of that. So police numbers do cut crime, but it's how you focus their efforts too. In particular, a lot of effort has gone into tackling knife crime and violence, because it blights our communities and impacts upon our young people. That has meant a 24% drop in knife crime in the last year, just by focusing on that effort. Burglary was down by 13%. One of the crimes that residents quite rightly feel makes them unsafe and is always there amongst their priorities. that was really important. We focused a squad, a crime squad, who is out there every day bringing more burglars and robbers and thieves to justice. They've secured hundreds of charges now in the last year. So it's a mixture of both numbers on the ground, focusing the attention, and some of the prevention work that we've done. My violence reduction unit, where we work with the councils and others, is doing talks in schools. It's getting the messages out there to young people and also to others as well. It's been a fantastic mix. We just need now the criminal justice system to show to these criminals that they're going to get long sentences and that justice will prevail.
Well, in balance, more than 7,000 burglaries reported in Kent between January and November of last year has seen the investigation end with no suspect identified, according to police data. Of that number, 71% were categorized as having a last income of investigation complete, no suspect identified, suggesting that these cases never reached a court hearing. What steps are you taking to reduce that figure to a more manageable level?
Well, burglary is a priority for me, and I've made it a priority for Kent Police. We make sure that every victim is contacted by Kent Police, and in the majority of cases, unlike in some other areas, most people do get a visit from the police, and where there are forensic opportunities, we send our CSI teams there as well. So by putting in the extra resource, we're focusing on the investigation to bring more people to justice. But we've also recently invested in a scheme where we've won funding from the government to really crack down on burglary in some hotspot areas. That includes boots on the ground, but also investment in new technology, video doorbells, prevention advice. So we're not letting up in our pursuit of burglars. We want to bring them to justice. I think that burglary is a heinous offence that people should go to prison for a very long time for. So that's a work that carries on.
Now, of course, as we record this, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, during this current period, there's been a lot of strain on frontline workers, including the police. Can you tell me how Kent Police has been coping with COVID-19 and what sort of actions are being taken to protect the people of Kent?
Well, I have to say that officers and staff and our volunteers actually have done a magnificent job of trying to protect us from COVID-19. But also keep themselves safe as well. And they really have stepped up to the plate. And after an initial blip where people were obviously shielding and they were getting tested, taking precautions, we've actually seen some of the lowest sickness rates in Kent Police, anywhere between 2 and 3%. So they really have stepped up. They're carrying on working through this, and they're doing some great things. In terms of what they have been visible out on the streets, they've been pursuing outstanding offenders and bringing in a number of people that were wanted during that time and supporting local communities. You know, they're out there at the moment supporting our retail sector and making sure that people are remembering to wear masks. And the last update I had from the chief only on Monday is that we'd only had 2 or 3 calls about it, which shows a great deal of support from the public for the measures which are needed. So, you know, full credit to Kent Police. They've been on top of the COVID-19 stuff and engaging with people rather than enforcing. They've broken up potential illegal raves, which we've seen blighting London and other communities. And that impact has been, I think, a positive response from the public.
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring up the B word, and that's Brexit, of course. As a county that's on the front line of our frontier with Europe, what sort of preparations are you making as a force to deal with the new challenges that come with an end to free movement? And also, if you can touch on Kent Police's approach to migrants that have entered the country via less than legal means.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brexit, of course, is an important issue in Kent because of our proximity to the continent. However, I supported Brexit. I voted for it. I believe it was the right thing to do, and I'm glad we've left the European Union. And on day one, after the result was clear, I was engaging with Kent Police to say, right, we need to make the best of this. We need to make sure that we've got the powers that we need, that we are working with other agencies to mitigate the impacts of traffic on local communities, and also understand some of the other challenges that will come along as a result of this. The majority of the work that was required was around our road network and our ports, and obviously Kent Police doesn't necessarily lead on those. So we had our Resilience Forum, an organisation made up of all of those responders who put together some really detailed plans in conjunction with Highways England to make sure that should there be any disruption during the course of a hard Brexit or disruption at our ports, that Kent wasn't going to be overcome by it. Those plans are ready should there be no agreement when we see the expiration date of the withdrawal agreement in December. And those are something which I continue to scrutinise. But also at a national level, making sure that we've got the powers that we need. European, and I've always been clear about this, European justice agencies want to carry on working with the UK because we contribute a lot. We contribute valuable intelligence and a substantial amount of it. They want to carry on working with us. It should be an easy deal for us to do. We just need to get it signed so that work can continue. And when it comes to the migrant crossings, again, this is a really important issue and one that I know that the Home Secretary is taking really seriously because of the impact that it will have on our local communities, the danger with which people are taking into their own hands in trying to attempt that crossing, but also perhaps the fact that these individuals should be claiming asylum somewhere else within the continent. That work is ongoing. Now, Kent Police isn't the lead agency when it comes to this. The Border Force, the National Crime Agency, and others will do. But often, in fact, Kent Police can be the first port of call, whether it's because they've raised a distress, as it were. They phone the police, say they're in distress, or police happen to be in the area, or the police, in fact, often get contacted by members of the public to say this has happened. It does mean that Kent Police have a role to play, but the lead role does come with other agencies. It's something that I continue to discuss with chief officers to make sure that we are making sure that there are reducing opportunities for people to get into our country by these less legal means.
Now, do you feel that there needs to be more pressure on the continental authorities to thwart these tries before they even begin?
I think so, and I think Priti Patel's been really strong on this in going over to meet her French counterparts and others and do some deals around this to make sure that either they're not departing from France in the first place or that they are claiming asylum in other parts. They often have to travel quite a substantial amount of distance to even get to the northernmost parts of France in order to do the crossing over to Dover. And I think that there is a role to play for the European Union and other member states to make sure that they're dealing with illegal immigration within their own borders. We don't know the individual circumstances of everyone who's trying to cross, and we have to be mindful of the fact that there are villains out there who are trying to exploit these people, take money off them, to try and help them make that crossing too. So there has to be a really joined-up approach of the European Union, the European justice agencies, as well as our teams at the National Crime Agency, Border Force and local policing too.
Well, if we could shift our focus from your role as PCC to your role as chairman of Blue Light Commercial, what exactly is this enterprise and how is it helping to save taxpayers' funds?
Well, this is a good example of how police and crime commissioners and police chiefs work together in order to do better in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. So Blue Light Commercial is only a very new company. You can find us on Google quite easily, Blue Light Commercial. We've been set up mainly to do two things. One is to try and improve policing's buying power within the market. We are 43 police forces and almost as many police and crime commissioners and deputy mayors. And it doesn't make sense for us to do all of that work either individually or in small groups. We spend £2.5 billion a year buying things for policing. So there is naturally some things that we can do better in the market, not just in terms of saving money, because that is quite important, but also get better kit for our officers, better understand the market. So we will be a team. I chair the board, and we have an excellent chief executive in Leanne Deeming, who's come across from outside of policing to run the company for us, backed up by the around 400 people who work in procurement within policing itself, upskilling them, giving them more market intelligence and enabling better commercial decisions. So we've got a funding program from the Home Office for around 3 years, which will help us get off the ground. But I believe that this again shows how we can work together to do better for police officers and staff and also for the taxpayer.
Absolutely, and it's a fantastic initiative. As this is the Leaders Council podcast, I'd like to delve into some of your views on leadership as a concept. And now, as longtime listeners will know, I always like to start this segment by asking the same simple question. What does the word leader mean to you?
I think it means a few things. I mean, from my point of view, I came into this role from a very different position. I was elected into my role, whereas some people will grow within their companies and within their industry. And for me, leadership is about a few things. It's about looking after your people. It's about collaboration, and it's being about listening. I think that if you want to get the best out of people, you have to listen, make them feel empowered to make their own decisions, back them when the time comes, but also take responsibility for them as well, so that accountability is never lost. I think that the people's individual circumstances also need to be taken into consideration, and that you can often get the best out of people by making adjustments to suit their own work-life balance and their own styles. So it's definitely something that I have to admit I've had to learn and grow into, because going from the role I was in before, which was very senior within Whitehall, working across government departments and the whip's office and things, and coming into this one was a challenge. But for me, it's about listening, collaborating, and trusting the people and valuing them.
Where would you say you derived your leadership style from? Did you have a particular role model, or were you shaped more by circumstance?
I think there's a few people that I've learned from. My main mentor in politics was David Evnett. A real example of how with good leadership, with skills, you can really get things done. He was a senior minister within the government, and he has been in Parliament and in politics now for over 40 years. And I think through learning from how he got things done, but also his determination as well. He lost his parliamentary seat in 1997 when obviously the Conservatives lost power there. Fought it again in 2001, was unsuccessful but reduced the Labour majority, and then fought it again in 2005 when others may have said, well, that's my time, or I can go off for a safe seat. He stuck with his community who trusted in him, and I think that says a lot about an individual. They're willing to stand up for their community and do that. So I've learned a lot from him as a mentor. But I think there are others that you can learn from in this area. But I don't think necessarily always in the same places. And often it's those you don't expect, like David, who can learn from the most.
Now, of course, one of the most challenging aspects of leadership is dealing with conflict. Do you have a particular method of how you resolve conflict?
Yeah, well, we are in a role where conflict is quite prevalent, whether that's between competing priorities, or whether that's between competing industries, or disagreements. I am the Police and Crime Commissioner for Kent, and I have my view. The Chief Constable runs his police force on a day-to-day basis, and he has his view. I think when it comes to resolving conflict, I think really you need to understand a lot more than what is probably on the surface. What's lying behind the reasons for the conflict? Where can we work together to try and solve the problem? Where can we get more out of this? And ultimately, who benefits? Because a conflict between a PCC and a Chief Constable might well be a regular occurrence, but actually who wins and who benefits from the decision that's made, and who loses out by not being able to resolve that conflict? And that is local people. We have a very collaborative approach. I talked about that in how I've learned from my experiences of being a leader. But collaboration is really key in some of those areas, and understanding those challenges. And we've dealt with a few issues recently where we've had to overcome that. But I think that ultimately, because we have a shared vision, I think that conflict is easier to resolve.
Now, I must ask, as a person who has proven he can win elections, What is your next step? Will we see you contesting a seat in the House in May of 2024?
Well, I've actually got an election in May 2021. So one of the consequences of COVID-19 was that the election for PCCs has actually been put back to May 21. So that's the next election. And that's the only one I've got my eyes on, because I don't think in politics you can ever take anything for granted. You should always go out at every election and earn your constituents' trust again. That's what I will be doing. And then, once the PCC review is done, and it looks like very positive, we could get some extra powers, I might seek to try and influence those maybe in term number 3. So we'll see what happens. But I'm very much focused on winning my seat back and listening to people's views in the run-up to next May.
Now, unfortunately, the sand is quickly falling through the glass. So before I let you go, what does the next 12 months have in store for Kent Police?
I think there's a few things. Firstly, it's recovering from COVID-19, and what I know that some of these phrases are almost becoming cliched now. But what is the new normal? We've learned a lot from the lockdown in terms of how the organisation works and how we can do things better. So it will be about recovery for the organisation and holding on to some of those gains in terms of productivity, but also holding on to some of those gains we've made with regards to crime. So at points within the first stage of the lockdown, crime was down about 22%. Crime was falling anyway before the lockdown came into force. But we have seen, obviously, because people were at home, fewer burglaries, fewer robberies, and things like that. We need to hold on to some of those gains that we've made and make sure that we keep crime falling. Recruitment continues. We are still recruiting more police officers. We've got about another 330 that we want to get in the next 2 years on top of what we've got already. And crucially, within that, we'll be making sure that the force is more representative of the communities that we serve. It's been a long-standing challenge for policing that we don't have enough people coming through from BAME backgrounds. We want to improve that. It is improving, but that's something that we've got to learn. So keeping crime falling, more recruitment, and recovering from the lockdown.
Well, Matthew, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the program today, and I do hope we can have you back on in a few months' time to see where you are at that point. But for now, Matthew, thank you.
Absolute pleasure.
That was Matthew Scott, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Kent. And now, if you haven't heard it before, is my exclusive interview with our chairman, Lord Blunkett. Lord Blunkett, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be with you.
Well, of course, nothing is being said at the moment other than COVID-19, which we must touch on. What would your message be to small businesses who are trying to keep going?
Well, I think the last ones standing will be the ones that thrive when we get back to some sort of normality. So it's have confidence and courage. Obviously take advantage as far as you can of the government help. I think that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has gone about as far as you could have expected in the circumstances. There are obviously small businesses that fall between the cracks. Those who don't have defined premises can't benefit from the business rate waiver, have not really been able to demonstrate that they can adhere to the PAYE for furloughing staff, and of course whether they can receive the grant, 10,000 or 25,000. All of those who can are obviously able at least to benefit from that for the time being and look to the future. But I think the second thing to say, and they don't need me to tell them this as a politician who did once do a business studies qualification, which is that it will be a different world, and being able to think about how that world will look in a year's time and be creative about it and learn from not just what's happening to you at this moment in time, but to others around you and the sector that you're working in, that will be really important.
Do you feel that the long-term effects of the COVID-19 outbreak will in some ways be positive for British industry?
Well, only in the sense that people are having to be creative, they're having to adjust and innovate. Therefore, they're thinking about more productive, if you like, greater productivity ways of delivering the same service or delivering the same products. And in that sense, I think we'll have temporarily at least very much higher unemployment than we've become used to, but we'll probably have a burst of productivity, which will help with the recovery. Whether it will help with the inequity of the way in which our economy is imbalanced, both between services and productivity and the production of goods and services, I'm not sure. What we will need to try and do is to ensure that the geographic imbalance that exists is, as far as humanly possible, is dealt with by both the entrepreneurship and innovation from the bottom up and targeted government help, which will still be needed. And we are now in the throes of the kind of borrowing that we saw back in 2008 to save the banking and economic system. We're having to do that to save the whole of our productive business and commerce. And I think that will have to be sustained for some time.
Do you feel that people will take a second look at global supply chains in the wake of this outbreak?
I think there's going to be much more creative ways of using local supply and linking up inside sectors much more effectively. And I hope that the Leaders' Council will be able to play a part in that, in the sense that people who have something in common, a synergy in terms of what they're delivering, whether it's a service or whether it's manufacturing or whatever, will be able to see that there's a good outcome from knowing the sector better, linking with people, not just geographically, locally, but those in this country who may not have been on the radar in terms of what they produced for the supply chain. And of course, ensuring, because there's quite a lot of fraud going on as we speak with people getting into cyber attacks, that they'll also take account of going into the cyber security side effectively as well. The more we are online, the more people who are working from home, the more vulnerable those businesses and their supply chain become. And that's something to think about as well.
How important is strong leadership at the moment?
Well, I actually think that it's brought to the fore leadership in a whole range of areas, from obviously government itself, and there's been ups and downs with the Prime Minister's severe illness, but all the way through the public and private sector. People have, to use the jargon, stepped up, and they've shown local, regional, national level the kind of leadership that Britain historically was very good at. Regrettably, we've not seen the same on the international scene for all kinds of reasons, but maybe we will in future. So I think out of this will come experience of people who have seen an opportunity to do good, as well as seen an opportunity to provide a good service or goods, including, for instance, shortages for the health and social care system, the food chain and the like, but also I think in terms of seeing the synergy between the private and the voluntary sector and using people's commitment to each other in a very positive way. I'm not sentimental about this. Things will revert. But actually, I think there's a kind of moment of moral judgment of people feeling that they've got a role to play outside the immediate survival that they're engaged in. And if we can hang on to a little bit of that social responsibility, that will be a very positive outcome.
Absolutely. Now, what's your broad view of how the government is responding to this? Are you broadly supportive of their measures?
Well, it may surprise people to hear that I have been very supportive. Of course, there's been legitimate criticisms about the speed of response on protective equipment and on issues relating to testing. But my own view is very similar to the challenge that was made to the Prime Minister of Italy when people said, why didn't you close Italy down faster? And he said, a fortnight before we did it, I would have been considered to be a madman and nobody would have agreed to do it if I'd tried to move too quickly. And I think that's something that we need to reflect on here in the UK. We may have seen the signals elsewhere across the world and taken them more seriously at the time. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, but as someone who's had his life in the opposite political party to the present government, I think that with some hiccups and mistakes, they've not done a bad job in what has been incredibly difficult circumstances.
And you're absolutely right. In a liberal democracy that we live in, it's very difficult for people to swallow orders given to them from government.
Well, the UK and the US, and to some extent the Scandinavian countries, have a very different history and therefore interest in maintaining the freedom to decide and the persuasion and consent that's required. Those countries that have experienced one way or another totalitarianism over the last century have a slightly different way of coming at this. I don't want to exaggerate it, but I think that that's why getting the balance right of getting people to go along with what you want them to do in their interests as well as the nation as a whole is a sensible, proportional balance. And I think we now need to adjust to the coming out of the crisis gradually, readjusting to recovery in the same way.
Now, something you've mentioned recently on this balance is the police overreach in the enforcement of the COVID-19 structures that have been put in place. What have they done right, and where have they gone too far?
Well, I think that they were interpreting what was not necessarily as clear advice as it might have been for all kinds of reasons, because people were feeling their way. I think what's come out of it has been a demonstration by local police services in some parts of the country that they could get people to do what was needed without the heavy hand of drones overhead or people being told that they shouldn't be walking in the street, because this was all about self-isolation, not incarceration. It was about getting people not to pass the infection on to each other and therefore to provide distance rather than to make our lives a misery. Those police services that adopted that policing by consent and chivying people along did really well. Those who went over the top, I think, soon got a very substantial pushback. And one of the strengths of our democracy is that you could have that debate. People could say, I'm terribly sorry, we think the police force in our area has gone over the top. And that in itself is a constraint and a readjustment. That's another strength of living in a country where you can have opinions and express them without actually being thought to be a fool.
Now, of course, the government has faced criticism that they were slow to react, and Boris Johnson wasn't present at the early COVID-19 COBRA meetings. Now, Number 10 has claimed that this is normal practice. The health secretary often chairs COBRA meetings related to health. Does this tally with your experience as a Secretary of State, or would you have expected the PM to be more hands-on during the initial stages?
I think different prime ministers do have a very different style. And Boris's style, which I think will now be considerably adjusted, was very swashbuckling. In some senses, delegating is a good thing, as every leader of every business or public service knows. Those who try to pull too much into themselves end up with a massive bottleneck, great failure of trust, and the inability of people to show what they're worth and to demonstrate their capability. So I'd be very wary of jumping in and saying he was wrong to delegate the essential COBRA meetings. What I was surprised about was that he didn't chair the first couple, because my experience with Tony Blair for the 8 years I was in cabinet was that Tony was a great delegator, but he would get a grip to begin with, watch what the difficulties were, and then give people direction and confidence to be able to get on with it. So looking back, I think Boris himself probably thinks, God, I wish I'd spotted the signals from elsewhere in the world more rapidly, and I'd just been there. However, this also raises another issue. All of us in positions of leadership need good teams around us. I think after this is over, he will be assessing those who really did step up and those who demonstrated their inadequacy. I think we'll probably end up in a year's time with a much stronger cabinet than we have today.
Well, absolutely. And of course, we've seen a significant drop in the visibility of certain special advisors like Dominic Cummings during this entire period. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out.
Well, it's certainly readjusted the role of those behind the scenes with those who should be taking the decisions, having received advice. Obviously, there's been a complete transformation in the profile of experts, if I might use that term, who'd previously been denigrated. Mm-hmm. Scientists, medics, people with behavioral science understanding. My only criticism was, were we getting wide enough advice? Were we narrowing it too much to a couple of key centres in London? But that's because I've always been adverse to everything being London-centric. I think there's great expertise, wisdom, experience out in the sticks, and we should use it.
Rightly so. Now, was pandemic planning part of your time as a minister, particularly perhaps when you were Home Secretary?
Well, it was, but it was on the back of risk arising out of counter-terrorism measures.
Right.
I was the Home Secretary for 3 months when the attack took place in September 2001 on the World Trade Center and beyond. We did an enormous amount of scenario planning, both desktop and real. On the back of that, it was very heavily orientated to future developing terrorism risk. I certainly got involved with talking about pandemics. I remember being at a seminar in Edinburgh where the university there had done a lot of work itself on the issue of pandemics. And of course, we saw SARS and other things emerging. I think people have criticised the government for not picking up the report from 2015, 5 years ago. I think that what happens is human nature kicks in. You deal with what you're immediately faced with. You can sponsor reports, and this is true of business planning, of course, as well, and scenario planning for what business continuity will look like, recovery plans for business, what will happen if there's a cyber attack, what happens if there's an energy shutdown. These kind of things you can look at, but you're immediately turning your eyes to what's in front of you. And had we picked up a bit more on the danger from Ebola and SARS and what have you in the past, then we might have said, what if something hits us in the developed nations that we don't have a vaccine for, that we can't immediately whisk up protective materials or equipment, or for that matter, medicines that help with recovery, all of which we now see are a danger. I think this will make an enormous difference to the planning for the years ahead. I hope it will be widened so that we don't just look at what's happened, but very rarely do you see something exactly repeat itself. Some of the circumstances will be, but others won't. So that's why I've put emphasis in what I talk about on looking at the other virus, the cyber attack scenario, which could be just as dangerous in a world of just-in-time provision. One of the miracles of the modern developed world, except for the very poor, has been the distribution of food. A lot of it on computerized, technologically advanced systems. If that were to come down, we'd be in real trouble. So I think we need to think those sort of scenarios as well.
So have a full plan across both sectors, biological warfare, pandemics, and cyber warfare.
Yes, and to do so on different levels. I think, again, thinking global but acting local, we need a lot more to think about what would happen if something took shape that actually broke down those national and global chains and how we would cope. And without, obviously, we've got enough fear and anxiety to last a lifetime. Without creating even more anxiety, we can think about those things for the future in a more rational way, I think.
Now, aside from the physical threat of the virus, one of the things that people are vastly worried about is the effect on the economy, not just national economy, but also the world economy. Now, it has been said by certain parties, and I'd like to garner your thoughts on this. Is there a danger of the effects of the lockdown being even worse than those of the virus?
Were it be prolonged, I fear that balance would tip the other way. It is about proportionality. It is about balance. It's the wisdom of Solomon, really, to get the moment right when you start to move and then to move quickly. There's no doubt whatsoever that we are stocking up, not just on the economic and employment front, which will be devastating enough, but on the health and social well-being front, enormous challenges. And they will need careful handling because there's a lot of people whose lives, for a variety of reasons, are at risk in the future on a scale that we've been dealing with over the immediate handling of the pandemic, concentrating really hard on those affected by COVID-19, those sadly who have died or been seriously incapacitated. That will roll over into the economic, the social, the mental health and cultural well-being of the nation, and that will need all of us to pull together as well.
Absolutely. Now, do you believe the government's doing enough for business?
I think that the speed of reaction once the scale of the pandemic was clear was very good. I've praised Rishi Sunak for his action. Remember, a chancellor who only just come into office was planning to deliver the budget in the middle of March and has had at least three equivalent budgets since. I think he's handled it very well. Understandably worried now about what we're doing to our economy. The level of borrowing is sustainable because of low interest rates, but it reaches a point, of course, where it tips over so that you can't then do the kind of structural investment requirements that the government were laying out before and in the March budget. And those will have their consequences as well as a planned payback over many years. I think we've learned something over the last few months. We needed to take immediate action. We don't want another round of austerity equivalent from 2010 through to 2019. I don't think the nation, on the back of what's happened and the challenges we have, could take that. And therefore, we need a different plan, economic plan, over a much longer period, just as we did from the Second World War all the way through to 2002, when the final American loans were paid off.
Now, of course, one thing that's on everyone's lips, how much longer do you believe that the lockdown can go on for?
I believe that we need to be substantially back in action as an economy in June. This obviously is led in terms of places where people would meet in large numbers, having to adjust to the fact that it will be longer for them. And sadly, that will involve business closures. It's why the Chancellor extended the furlough scheme to the end of June. Mm-hmm. But unless we get things moving in June, I think we'll run into the summer where all kinds of services and industries will have a chain reaction effect. And what happens with one will then have a major impact on another. And then you get the skittle effect where things get knocked down that you hadn't perceived were going to be affected. So I very much, if I were in government, and I always think of things in that context, what would I do if I were in government? I would be on the side from the second week in May, on the side of the hawks in terms of saying we've got to start moving, and we've got to do so with the collaboration and cooperation of the public who have got the message, who did behave, who responded magnificently. Let's try and get back, perhaps, doing things differently for a time, but substantially getting back to business as usual. And unless we do that, then those areas that can't and wouldn't expect to be back in action immediately get pushed further into the middle of the year and the autumn, and then they become unsustainable.
Now, of course, one of the other major developments we've had recently are the changes in the Labour Party. So if we could just speak on the Labour Party for a while. This might sound like an obvious question, but how does Sir Keir differ from Mr. Corbyn?
Well, I'm biased because I believe the Labour Party has come out of 4.5 years of a black hole of a nightmare, where it neither represented a credible opposition nor an electable government, and the combination was to let those who supported the Labour Party and needed some of its policies let them down very badly. Sir Keir Starmer both is a highly intelligent, professional lawyer who, as Director of Public Prosecutions, led the service well, had to take difficult decisions at a time of austerity, understands the world beyond Labour members, but has been able to do business with those who originally supported Jeremy Corbyn and was able to command support from them. His creation of a balanced shadow ministerial team has been very encouraging. I supported Lisa Nandy, who he's made Shadow Foreign Secretary, because I thought she understood the north of England and the disaffected former Labour voters. But I believe that Sir Keir has taken on board those who have something really sensible to offer, and I believe he will be both a great leader of the opposition. More importantly, he will then present himself as a credible alternative Prime Minister. And all governments need an alternative government at their shoulder. It was true of us from 97, and it took the Conservatives some time to recover and to get to that position, but they did, and the Labour Party will, and that's crucial for our democracy. All of us need to understand and appreciate that a living, breathing, functioning democracy requires a credible, confident, and in many ways supportable opposition, as well as a government that we clearly want to do well, because none of us want, as we didn't with the COVID crisis, none of us want the government to fail. We want to see our economy recover. We want our social well-being to be taken into account. We want to overcome deep-seated inequality and poverty, and we want to do it with enterprise and entrepreneurship and business playing their role. And that is about leadership nationally, locally, in the private and the public sector, people with ideas, with confidence, with the ability to pull teams around them, above all, to have some idea of what it is they want to achieve and a very good idea as to how to achieve it.
Now, of course, one of the biggest problems Sir Keir is facing will be tackling the party's anti-Semitism problem. There has been a recent internal report that has been quite damning. What's your response to that report, and what does Sir Keir need to do in response?
Well, there are two reports. One which is being produced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which he will, and has already indicated, will implement in full. The second was a leaked report put together by the supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, 800 pages of private interchanges on social media, which he has, Keir Starmer, set up an investigation to identify who did it, who leaked it, what the content was, does it have any salience and lessons for us, and where necessary, action will be taken. So I hope that as he moved very quickly to reassure the Jewish community, so he will be able to take the necessary steps to back up that reassurance with the kind of actions that says that this was a blight on a historic, great political party that all of us were ashamed of. We've been able to put that behind us and to move on to facing the future with confidence.
What's the one key thing that Sir needs to do to restore Labour as an election-winning party?
I think Sir Keir Starmer's major challenge is to convince sceptical voters that Labour has not only reverted to a party that they can support because they can see it acting, developing, presenting as a credible alternative government, but also that the lessons have been learned from the fiasco from 2015 onwards. In other words, there have to be very clear signals of substantial change, not just the right words, not just reassurance that we're not going back to some of the crazier policies, but actually that we've understood why the electorate rejected those policies so substantially in December 2019. If people get that message, they'll understand that the Labour Party has changed, as it did in the 1980s and early 90s, to become the electable government with the greatest majority in historic majority, even greater than 1945, which I was privileged to be able to take advantage of in 1997 when I joined the cabinet.
Now, I know what your answer is going to be to this question, but indulge me. Do you think Sir Keir has what it takes to be PM?
Yes, I do. I think he has the background, he has the experience, he has the professionalism, he has the forensic mindset, and he has the confidence to have put a team around him which will ensure that it will work. And those elements are true of all leaders. Ideas, the ability to build a team, to have confidence in that team, and to be able to demonstrate leadership in practice, sometimes at the most difficult times. And, you know, the Leaders' Council, those sharing their thoughts with the kind of thing that we're doing now with a podcast, but also joining us in linking up in that network of people who can support and help each other and learn from each other. That is what needs to be done in politics as it needs to be done in business. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew.
Well, thank you for coming on the program. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all those listening in what has been a nightmare scenario. Good luck for the future. Have courage, have confidence, and yes, listen to those who know more about business than I ever will.
Thank you, Lord Blunkett.
Thank you.
This has been the Leaders' Council podcast. Thank you for celebrating excellence in leadership with us. I have been your host, Matthew O'Neill. Until next time, goodbye. Thank you for listening to our podcast. The views expressed within the podcast do not reflect the views of the Leaders' Council of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, its parent company or subsidiaries, members of staff, other guests, or any other person therein associated.